So imagine for a second finding a letter, like a 150-year-old letter that just completely diagnoses your modern anxieties about the future.
Right.
It just dissects your daily struggles with, envy and stress, and then it hands you this absolute guarantee of peace.
Which is pretty rare to find anywhere, honestly.
Oh, for sure, but it cuts right through all the noise of our current era and hands you a blueprint for total, unshakable satisfaction. Welcome to Reformed Thinking, everybody.
Glad you were with us.
We have a really extensive examination lined up for you today. We are looking at Charles Spurgeon's sermon number 25.
Titled, The Hope of Future Bliss.
Right. He delivered this on a Sunday evening, May 20th, 1855, at Exeter Hall in London.
And we are analyzing the complete transcript of this specific message, which is based entirely on Psalm 17, verse 15.
Our mission for this deep dive is to extract the core insights regarding how a 19th century theological giant understood future bliss, human suffering, and true satisfaction.
We are going to break down his vibrant analogy so you can grasp the full weight of his message.
Yeah, but first, we really have to set the scene. You have to recognize who is speaking and where this is happening.
Right, Exeter Hall.
Yes, Exeter Hall. It was this massive auditorium. We're talking upwards of 4,000 people, just packed shoulder to shoulder.
In the absolute heat and soot of industrial London.
Imagine the smell alone. The body heat in that room. And Spurgeon himself, this is the craziest part, he was only 20 years old when he preached this.
It's staggering. Just a 20-year-old commanding that kind of room.
And he starts with a premise that feels entirely counterintuitive, focusing right out of the gate on the enemies of the gospel.
Yeah, he opens by completely flipping the script on adversity. Spurgeon proposes that the Christian faith actually owes an immense debt to its enemies.
Which is wild, because we naturally assume that the friends of the faith are the ones who advance it.
Right. The missionaries, the preachers, the martyrs, we think they do all the work. But Spurgeon argues that the enemies, completely unwittingly, have done a massive amount of the heavy lifting.
How so?
Well, he points back to the early days of the church. When early believers faced intense persecution, that very persecution is what scattered them abroad.
Right. Like if they had just been left alone, they might have stayed completely comfortable in Jerusalem.
Precisely. They would have just built a nice community and stayed put. But because they were actively hunted, they took the message to places like Antioch, Cyprus, and way beyond.
And he uses this fantastic analogy from botany here, doesn't he?
He does. It's so good. He compares the gospel to a specific medicinal herb. In the natural world, certain herbs, he uses chamomile, for instance, they actually grow faster and spread wider the more you trample on them.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the friction, the crushing action, the violent bruising of the leaves, these are the very things that release the seeds and cause the plant to thrive.
So, like, the attempt to eradicate it is the precise mechanism that cultivates it.
Spot on. You step on the plant trying to kill it, and you end up planting a dozen more.
That is such a vivid image. And he grounds this concept squarely in the life of David, right? The author of Psalm 17.
Yes. Spurgeon details David's historical context to make this point. He describes David being hunted like a partridge on the mountains, driven like a timid roe before the hunter's dogs.
We really have to picture the physical reality of that.
Oh, absolutely. David was hiding in the dark, damp, jagged caves of Engedi. He was dealing with the absolute paranoia of King Saul trying to pin him to a wall with a spear.
Literally trying to skewer him.
Right. And Spurgeon makes a very strong historical and psychological claim here. He says without this severe distress, without being relentlessly hunted, David would never have penned what Spurgeon calls experimental utterances in the Psalms.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning we would not have these raw, authentic declarations of faith. They were born out of the experiment of extreme suffering.
I want to push back on that logic a little bit, though, because it makes you wonder, does this mean peace and comfort are actually detrimental to producing solid theology or genuine faith?
That's a fair question.
Like for you listening, are we supposed to actively seek out misery? Or at least be highly suspicious of our own comfort just to ensure our spiritual experience is authentic?
Well, I don't think it is that comfort is inherently evil, but Spurgeon is diagnosing what extreme pressure produces in the human soul. He talks about the iron hand of anguish.
The iron hand of anguish, wow.
Yeah. It is the intense pressure of that iron hand that wrings out genuine declarations of trust. Think about it this way. When David finally got a rare moment to rest his weary limbs by the brooks of Siloah,
his praise was incredibly authentic because the threat he faced just the day before was undeniably real.
yes, His theology was not theoretical. It was forged in an absolute survival situation. When we live in relative safety, our faith can easily become just an intellectual exercise.
Right. We say we believe God provides, but we also have a refrigerator completely full of groceries and a stable paycheck.
Exactly. David was relying on God for his literal next breath and his physical safety from armed men. So when he speaks about hoping in God, it carries a weight, a density that a comfortable, insulated life simply cannot manufacture.
The pressure cooker environment just strips away all the theoretical fluff.
It does.
And it is that specific high-stakes environment that produced the bold declaration we are looking at today in Psalm 17, verse 15.
As for me, I will behold thy face in righteousness. I shall be satisfied when I awake with thy likeness.
Spurgeon spends the rest of the message breaking down the specific mindset, the spirit, as he calls it, that David held when making this claim.
And he identifies the first element of that spirit as a mindset totally free from envy.
To really get this, we need to look at the verses right before verse 15. David is observing wicked men who are just absolutely thriving.
The contrast is pretty stark. David looks at his enemies, and the text describes them as being enclosed in their own fat.
Which sounds like an insult to us today.
Right, but in the ancient Near East, having surplus fat was the ultimate signifier of extreme wealth, luxury, and security. It meant you had an abundance of resources while everyone else was starving.
They were the ultra-wealthy of their day.
Yep. These men speak proudly, they have plenty of children to carry on their legacy, and they have so much surplus wealth, they are leaving massive inheritances to their babes.
By every earthly metric of the ancient world, these guys are winning.
They are. They have security, legacy, and comfort. Yet David looks at them, draws a line in the sand, and says, as for me, he is completely indifferent to their success.
Spurgeon has some incredibly intense things to say about the nature of envy itself here.
He doesn't hold back.
Not at all. He calls envy Satan's firstborn and the vilest of all vices. He paints these cosmic pictures of destruction, saying that if the wind of envy blew on the Garden of Eden, it would completely deface it.
And if it breathed on the blazing sun, it would crunch it.
If it looked at the moon, it would turn it to blood. I mean, he is portraying envy not just as a bad habit, but as an absolute poison that rots reality.
He is diagnosing how envy destroys the human capacity to enjoy anything. You can give a person immense riches, but if you introduce envy into their heart, there is a worm eating at the root of that fair tree.
That's a great way to put it.
You can grant someone genuine happiness, but if they start envying someone else's lot, their happiness sours into misery. And simply because it is not as visible or as grand as their neighbors.
Envy forces you to constantly measure your own joy against someone else's highlight reel, and that measurement just obliterates your joy.
To illustrate the absurdity of this, Spurgeon uses a series of animal analogies that are pretty fun.
Oh, I love these.
He asks, does the ox envy the lion? No, because the ox cannot digest carcasses. It eats grass.
Right.
Does the dove grieve because the raven can gloat over carrion? No, they require entirely different food. Will the eagle envy the wren's tiny nest in the bush?
The eagle analogy is brilliant. It perfectly maps onto how we interact with social media today, for those of you listening.
Oh, for sure.
You are scrolling, you see someone else's perfect vacation, their massive house, their flawless family photos, and you feel this sharp pang of jealousy. You feel like you are losing the game.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens.
But Spurgeon is pointing out a category error. Feeling jealous of that earthly wealth is like the massive eagle looking at the wren's tiny, fragile nest and being upset that he doesn't fit inside it.
It's ridiculous when you think about it.
Once you realize you are an eagle, that you are not even playing the same game or seeking the same prize, the jealousy just evaporates.
And the cure for envy, according to this framework, is never acquiring more stuff so you can match the people around you.
That just fuels the fire.
It does. The cure is a radical shift in identity, believing that you possess something entirely different and infinitely superior.
The Christian can look at all the wealth and power in the world and genuinely disdain it.
Spurgeon mentions disdaining the wealth of Croesus, the ancient king famous for his legendary gold, or the military force of Caesar.
Why?
Because the believer's portion is the Lord himself. You do not envy the earthly king because you are waiting on a heavenly inheritance that makes earthly gold look like cheap dirt.
But, this requires a massive shift in perspective. You have to constantly look forward, which brings up Spurgeon's next point about the spirit of this text.
Right, living on the future.
Yes. He argues that the wise person lives on expectation, while living only for the present is the mark of a fool.
He provides several striking historical examples of this principle in action. He talks about the poet John Milton.
Ah, Milton.
When Milton was penning his great epic Paradise Lost, he was blind, impoverished, and out of political favor.
Not a great spot to be in.
No. And he likely knew he would receive very little fame or compensation during his actual lifetime. But he wrote with the expectation that he would be honored long after his head slept in the grave. He lived entirely on the expectation of a future reward.
Spurgeon also shares this great little anecdote about a poor minister walking to preach at a rustic, humble chapel.
Right. This poor minister runs into a much wealthier clergyman who boasts that he never preaches for less than a guinea.
Which was a substantial coin in those days.
Yes, a lot of money. The poor man replies that he expects a crown for his preaching, referring to the biblical crown of life, but he is content to wait for it in the future.
He is willing to forsake immediate earthly payment for a future eternal one.
Exactly.
Spurgeon uses this breathtaking imagery of going to the great Niagara of Hope and drinking the spray of heaven.
I love that phrase, the Niagara of Hope.
It's so vivid. Just standing near the waterfall of what is promised in the future, feeling the spray on your face, is enough to ravish the soul with delight.
Yeah.
But let me stop you right there, because I can totally hear modern listeners objecting to this.
Well, I'm sure.
If you spend all your time standing at the Niagara of Hope, just drinking the spray of the future, don't you become completely useless in the present?
Right. The old critique.
Yeah. If your head is always in the clouds anticipating heaven, how do you fix the very real, immediate problems on earth?
That is the classic critique. You're so heavenly minded you are of no earthly good. But Spurgeon counters this by looking at history. He argues the exact opposite is true.
How so?
This expectation of the future is the highest motivating force for present action. It does not make a person passive, it makes them fearless.
That's a huge distinction.
He points to Martin Luther standing bold before an audience of hostile kings and lords at the Diet of Worms, refusing to back down or recant.
What gave Luther that unyielding courage?
The absolute knowledge that his future was secure, regardless of whether they burned him at the stake that very day. Spurgeon notes that this is the very thing that drives a missionary across stormy seas to barbarous shores, risking disease and death.
They're not paralyzed by hoping in the future. They are propelled by it.
Yes. Because the future reward is entirely secure, they can risk absolutely everything in the present moment.
But staking your entire present life on a future promise requires an absurd amount of confidence.
It really does.
You cannot just sort of hope it might be true or cross your fingers. You have to know it in your bones. And that leads to the third aspect of the spirit of the text.
The audacity of assurance.
Right. David's wording in the text is absolute. He says, I will behold and I shall be satisfied. There is no perhaps. There is no if things work out.
And Spurgeon acknowledges that polite society in his day, and certainly in ours, might call this level of certainty pure fanaticism.
For sure. People hate when you speak with absolute certainty about religion.
They might consider it supreme arrogance or presumption for any human being to claim absolute certainty about what happens after death. But Spurgeon insists that thousands of believers possess this assured confidence.
They do not doubt it any more than they doubt their own pulse.
And how do they get this confidence? Spurgeon explains that God tests strong faith. He uses a fascinating metallurgical analogy talking about Toledo blades.
The Spanish swords. Can you explain the mechanics of that analogy? It's really specific.
Yeah, so Toledo steel from Spain was historically famous for being incredibly strong, holding a razor edge while remaining flexible enough not to shatter in combat.
Okay.
The forging process was brutal heating, hammering, quenching. Spurgeon says that God's swords must be used. God takes the old Toledo blades of heaven, meaning strong, resilient faith, and he smites them against the armor of the evil one.
He puts that faith through violent collisions and heavy blows to prove that true metal will not snap.
Exactly. God does not grant this level of rock-solid certainty without putting the believer through the forge of fiery trials.
The certainty is hammered out in the furnace of affliction.
You know the promise is true because it has survived the absolute worst the world can throw at it without breaking.
He illustrates that forged faith with a deeply moving scene. He describes an aged, paralyzed Christian living in a ragged garret.
Right, and for context, a garret in 1855 London was a tiny freezing room at the very top of a dilapidated house.
The roof is so damaged that the stars shine right through the gaps in the tiles.
The old man is shaking, weak, his clothes are torn, and he hasn't eaten since yesterday.
But Spurgeon says, if you were to walk into that freezing room and offer this man Caesar's palace, or put handfuls of gold in front of him on the condition that he give up Christ, the old man's eyes would burn with indignation.
He would refuse instantly because he has absolute certainty. He knows he will soon behold God's face.
The temporary wealth of Caesar means absolutely nothing compared to the permanent certainty of what is coming tomorrow.
That old man's face is the Toledo blade. It is not theoretical. It has been tested by grinding poverty, by gnawing hunger, by bodily weakness, and the bitter cold of the garret.
And because it has survived all of that, his statement, I shall be satisfied, carries an invincible weight.
The trials burn away any reliance on earthly comfort, leaving only the pure steel of his trust in the future promise.
Summarizing the spirit of the text, then, we see a mindset that is envious of absolutely nothing on earth, constantly looking forward, and possessing a battle-tested, unbreakable certainty.
Which brings us to the second major movement of Spurgeon's thought.
Right, we shift from the spirit of the text to the matter of the text. What are the actual blessings promised in this verse? What is the believer so certain about getting?
The text outlines two distinct blessings. The first is, I will behold thy face in righteousness.
Spurgeon builds up to the staggering concept of beholding God's face by making an argument from the lesser to the greater.
He asks us to consider God's hand in nature. We see the work of his hand when lightning splits the dark clouds.
We see it in the night sky, where the massive planets roll in majestic orbits.
Or where comets are, as he poetically puts it, brooded by the sun.
We hear his deep bass voice in the roaring of the ocean and the crashing of the thunder.
Spurgeon argues that if we only see a tiny fraction of the fabric of creation, and it is awe-inspiring, what must it be to bypass the creation entirely and actually behold the unshielded face of the Creator?
He tells a historical story to illustrate how overwhelming this glory would be. He mentions a porter whose job was standing at the door of the ancient temple of Diana at Ephesus.
This temple was one of the wonders of the ancient world, splendidly decorated with vast amounts of shining gold.
Right. And as visitors approached in the bright Mediterranean sun, the porter had to constantly warn them, take heed to your eyes, you will be struck with blindness.
The sheer reflection of the gold was physically damaging to human sight.
Spurgeon uses this to say that the glory of God's actual face is infinitely brighter. Looking at it directly would annihilate a normal human being.
But he points to a specific condition in the text. David says, I will behold thy face in righteousness.
Why is that specific modifier the key to surviving the vision?
Well, that phrase, in righteousness, is the core of Reformed theology. Spurgeon clarifies that currently our human vision of God is heavily clouded. It is obscured by our physical frailty, our sin, and our folly.
He talks about the gross materialism and the dust of this poor carnal world that ruins our spiritual sight.
Even when believers have moments of deep communion with God on earth, it is seen through a glass darkly.
Right, it's muffled.
But to behold him in righteousness means that the believer will be pure, white, and completely free from sin. This isn't just about trying hard to be good. It's the concept of imputed righteousness.
The believer is clad in the perfect righteousness of Jesus Christ.
All the earthly dust is brushed off. This absolute granted purity is the only thing that allows for a clear, unmediated face-to-face view of the divine without the person being destroyed by the brightness.
You can only look upon absolute holiness if you yourself have been made completely, flawlessly righteous.
That's right.
And experiencing that unobstructed vision leads directly to the second massive blessing of the text. Absolute satisfaction. David says, I shall be satisfied.
Spurgeon draws a sharp contrast between the comfort believers experience now and the total fulfillment coming later.
Right now, a Christian might have a wellspring of comfort within them, but they are never thoroughly satisfied.
There is always a lingering hunger, a physical ache, a question left unanswered.
But heaven, Spurgeon argues, is the home of true and final satisfaction. He details how different human faculties will reach their absolute peak capacity and find rest.
Which is a fascinating way to break it down.
I want to walk through those faculties, starting with the imagination, because human imagination is wild. We can always dream up something slightly better than what we have. How does heaven satisfy that?
Well, think about the most beautiful, awe-inspiring concept your mind can possibly generate. A perfect landscape, perfect harmony, perfect joy.
Okay.
Spurgeon says that in heaven, every holy idea will be solidified. Every mighty conception will become a tangible reality. The imagination will be completely maxed out.
You literally will not be able to conceive of anything better than what you are actively experiencing.
The actual reality of heaven will outshine the highest luster of human thought. You won't be able to dream of a better place because you're standing in the ultimate reality.
What about the intellect? Human curiosity seems infinite. We always want to know how things work, why things happen.
Spurgeon says the intellect will finally be at rest because all the secrets of nature, all the hidden mechanisms of the universe will be revealed.
So no more frustrating mysteries.
And more importantly, all the agonizing over the why of God's providence will be answered. The things that confuse us on earth will make perfect sense.
He also mentions the memory being satisfied. That feels highly counterintuitive to me.
How so?
Usually looking back at the past brings up intense regrets, trauma, or pain. How does memory become a source of satisfaction?
He means that believers will look back on the entire vista of their past years, including all the suffering, the betrayals, the trials, and the physical pain, and they will be perfectly content with it.
Wow.
With their perfected intellect, they will see how every single hardship was a necessary, meticulously placed thread in the larger design of God's grace.
They will see that the iron hand of anguish was actually guiding them home.
As a result, there will be no wish to alter a single agonizing detail of what they endured. Every memory will be redeemed.
Now, this brings us to a part of the text that we have to handle carefully because it is highly provocative and deeply jarring to modern sensibilities.
It really is.
Spurgeon argues that in heaven, believers will be so perfectly aligned with God's will that they will be completely satisfied, even with the damnation of the lost.
Yes.
He goes so far as to claim that even parents, looking at the judgment of their own children, would not shed a tear.
He says they would recognize it as perfect justice that magnifies God's glory.
He uses an intense, almost brutal analogy, noting that from the high vantage point of heaven, earthly rebels will appear as tiny as insects swept away in a field, or like a nest of wasps that has been exterminated for the injury they caused. And I just want to emphasize here, we're just imparting his specific views from the text impartially.
It is an incredibly stark image, and it completely violates our modern human-centric way of thinking.
It does. I struggle to wrap my head around it, to be honest. How does Spurgeon justify prioritizing divine justice so radically over human emotional bonds? What is the underlying theological logic that allows him to stand in front of thousands of people and say something so severe?
To grasp Spurgeon's logic, we have to understand the bedrock premise of his worldview.
Okay.
In his framework, God's glory, his holiness, and his justice are the absolute gravitational center of the entire universe. The chief end of man is to glorify God.
Right now, on Earth, our perspective is entirely anthropocentric. It revolves around human relationships, human feelings, and human survival.
We measure goodness by how it affects people, but Spurgeon is arguing that when human minds are perfected in heaven, those human-centric priorities dissolve.
The believer's will becomes so flawlessly merged with God's will that whatever God decrees is seen as perfectly beautiful and right.
Therefore, the magnification of God's justice, even in the severe punishment of sin, becomes an ultimate source of satisfaction because it upholds the righteousness of the Creator.
So he is arguing that in our perfected sinless state, we will finally see the true horror and severity of sin.
We will see how it was like a nest of wasps, causing violent injury to God's created order. And we will completely agree with the justice of its eradication. We will love God's justice as much as we love his mercy.
It is a sobering lens into how 19th century theology viewed the hierarchy of the universe. The creator is paramount, and the creature is entirely subordinate.
It's a massive paradigm shift.
But Spurgeon moves from the nature of this satisfaction to the specific timing of it. The text says, "When I awake."
The timing is critical because it introduces a technical theological difficulty. There are souls of the righteous currently in heaven, but according to Spurgeon's reading of the text, they are not yet fully satisfied.
Why?
Because their physical bodies are still slumbering in the earth. The awaking refers specifically to the bodily resurrection on the last day.
He describes the earth as one vast sleeping house, a giant cemetery holding the physical remains of the saints. He uses this grand cinematic analogy of a Roman conqueror to explain the difference between the soul going to heaven now versus the bodily resurrection later. Can we unpack the Roman triumph imagery?
Yeah, let's do it.
Because to us, a parade is just, balloons and marching bands. But Spurgeon's audience had a classical education. They knew the weight of a Roman triumph.
A Roman triumph was not a simple parade. It was the highest possible honor a mortal could achieve in the ancient world. It was a massive, state-sanctioned religious and military ceremony.
So what's the parallel?
Spurgeon explains that when a Roman general won a great war, he might return to his house quietly at first, just to rest. That is like the soul going to heaven at death. It is a quiet entry into rest. They steal into heaven.
But the next day,
The next day, the general would go out of the city and re-enter it in a massive official triumph. He would ride in a chariot, followed by the spoils of war, his victorious soldiers and the captives. The crowds would go wild.
Spurgeon says the bodily resurrection at the end of time is the grand Roman triumph.
He paints a picture of Christ leading a massive procession, wearing many crowns, followed by all the saints with golden harps.
The angels are crowding the windows and the housetops of heaven, acting like the citizens of Rome.
Scattering roses and lilies on the returning army and shouting, "Hallelujah!"
That specific moment, when the body and soul are reunited and march into glory, is the moment of complete, total satisfaction.
And the text adds one final detail to that awakening. With thy likeness.
In thy likeness refers specifically to the physical body.
The Reformed view of the material world is that God created matter, and matter is good. Salvation isn't just about floating spirits, it includes the redemption and restoration of the physical body.
The believer's body is going to be altered to be like Christ's glorious body.
Spurgeon admits human language fails to fully comprehend what Christ looks like in glory. He references John's vision in Revelation, where Christ's eyes are like lamps of fire and his hair is white as snow.
Whatever that glorious, indestructible likeness is, the believer will share it.
He gets very specific with examples from his own time to show what this means practically.
Remember, the Crimean War was happening around this time, so military casualties were on everyone's mind.
Exactly. He talks about a soldier who died in battle. The soldier had his legs shot away by a cannonball. His body was scarred by saber thrusts and hacked apart.
But when he wakes on that resurrection morning, he is not broken. He wakes up completely whole in the likeness of Christ.
He also talks about an aged matron, haggard, tottering on a staff, time having plowed deep furrows into her brow. She is laid in the grave, frail and worn out.
But she arises in youth and unblemished vigor.
He mentions those who suffered severe physical deformities during their earthly lives. They wake up in flawless form.
And he adds a really fascinating equalizer to this concept of physical resurrection.
He notes that physical attractiveness on earth will mean absolutely nothing in the resurrection.
Those who are considered the most beautiful, the fairest in society, will be no brighter in heaven than those who are ignored, neglected, or considered plain.
The earthly hierarchy of beauty is completely erased because everyone will equally share the glorious, perfect likeness of Christ.
It is this massive, swelling crescendo of hope and physical glory. But right at the peak of it, Spurgeon executes a sharp pivot.
He does. It's a rhetorical whiplash.
He abruptly turns away from this glorious promise to deliver a sobering reality check to the thousands of people sitting in front of him in Exeter Hall. He brings us to the sad contrast.
He brings the lofty heavenly vision crashing down into the immediate present reality. He looks at the crowd and says, "We shall all slumber."
He points out that the current life they are living is just a stage, a hurried nap, a dissolving view.
In a few short decades, every single person sitting in that massive hall will be dead and buried.
He references the ancient Persian king Xerxes.
Historical accounts say that when Xerxes stood at the Hellespont and looked out over his massive, invincible army of 1,000,000 men, he began to weep.
Because he realized that in a little while, every single one of those men would be gone.
Spurgeon uses a line that just gives you chills. He says, "The tree is already growing that will be sawn to make your coffin."
Wow. The tree is already growing that will be sawn to make your coffin.
It is a brilliant rhetorical device designed to pierce through any illusion of earthly permanence. He wants them to realize that the sod is already prepared for them.
And once he establishes their mortality, he moves directly into an apocalyptic judgment scene.
He describes the final day, the sea boiling, the heavens rent in twain.
Christ is no longer the quiet Savior on a cross. He comes riding on clouds fashioned into a chariot with wings of fire.
He opens the book of probations, hushes the entire chaotic world with a single nod, and issues a command to the angels: divide the universe.
Swifter than thought, the earth parts. The great divide happens.
The stark separation is mapped out. To the righteous on his right, Christ says, "Come, you've been coming all your life, take the last step."
Their entire earthly life was a steady progression toward him, and this is just the final realization of that path.
But to the wicked on his left, he says, "Depart. You have been departing from me all your life. Take the last step."
They spent their lives moving away from God, ignoring his laws, and now they're given over to that trajectory permanently.
At that terrifying moment, Spurgeon says, the Savior becomes the avenger. The hands that once held out mercy now grasp the sword of justice.
Spurgeon paints a terrifying picture here. The wicked fly like deer before a lion and enter the jaws of the pit. It is incredibly heavy.
I can imagine the absolute silence in Exeter Hall.
How does he pivot from the sword of justice to offering a way out to the people listening? He can't just leave them there, dangling over the pit.
No, he refuses to close the sermon without telling his audience exactly how to be saved from that sword.
He shifts from the terror of the judgment to the immediate availability of grace.
He moves into his final call to action, explaining the precise mechanism of salvation, faith.
And he is very careful to define what faith is and what it is not. He contrasts true faith with just intellectual assent.
He says faith is not just saying, I know Christ died for me.
He specifically points out the Arminian theological view here. To clarify for our listeners without getting bogged down in jargon, the theological debate in the 19th century between Calvinists, like Spurgeon, and Arminians was intense.
Broadly speaking, Arminians hold that Christ's death made salvation universally possible for anyone who chooses it, whereas the Reformed view is that Christ actually secured salvation for the elect.
And again, we're just laying out his argument here impartially. Spurgeon's point here is that simply agreeing with a doctrine, saying, I believe Jesus died for sinners, is not enough.
Intellectual agreement is not saving faith.
To illustrate what true faith actually looks like, he uses a story about a Negro who described his own conversion.
The man said, I fling myself flat on deep promise and dare I lay.
That is Spurgeon's definition of faith.
It is not an intellectual exercise of checking boxes on a doctrinal statement. It is a complete, desperate casting of oneself onto the mercy of Jesus.
You throw your entire weight onto the promise that he is able to save you, and you do not move. You have no backup plan.
He follows this up with another analogy about a Polish refugee.
In the 1850s, London had many political refugees, so this was a very contemporary reference for his audience.
Imagine a decree is posted on a brick wall inviting all Polish refugees to return to their home country safely.
A man reads the poster. He does not need to see his specific surname. Spurgeon uses the name Wolowski, printed on the poster, to know he is invited.
His first name, metaphorically, is Polish, and his last name is refugee. Because he fits the description of the category, the promise applies to him perfectly.
And Spurgeon applies this directly to the Bible and the listener's spiritual anxiety.
He says you are not going to find the specific name John Smith written in the Book of Life as a direct, personalized invitation.
But you do not need to. Your first name is lost, and your surname is sinner.
The invitation in the gospel is addressed to the lost sinner. That is all the identification you need to claim the promise of salvation.
If you are a lost sinner, the decree applies to you. Fling yourself on it.
This leads into a very pastoral moment where Spurgeon addresses a specific theological anxiety that paralyzed many of his listeners.
In Reformed circles, people often worried about the doctrine of election.
They were terrified that they might not be one of God's elect, and therefore, no matter what they did, they could not be saved.
It was a massive source of despair.
Spurgeon addresses it head-on. He tells them essentially to stop worrying about election at the beginning of their spiritual walk.
He uses a great educational metaphor. He says election is a college you only attend after you have gone to the primary school of repentance.
Do not try to read the book backwards.
He uses the Lord's Prayer as another example. You have to begin by saying, Our Father, before you can get to the end where you say, Thine is the kingdom.
You cannot start at the kingdom and work backward to the Father. You begin with faith. You begin with empty hands.
He states beautifully that just as God made the physical universe out of nothing, he always makes his Christians out of nothing. You have to bring your own nothingness to him.
To drive that point home as we close out our analysis, Spurgeon shares one final, incredibly touching anecdote.
He talks about a poor woman who was struggling with her faith, agonizing over whether she was elect, trying to figure out how to be saved.
She was converted simply by walking down a street and hearing a child sitting at a door singing a tiny, simple song.
The lyrics were, I am nothing at all, but Jesus Christ is all in all.
That tiny song is the entire synthesis of the sermon.
The text starts with David facing intense persecution and the iron hand of anguish.
It moves through a complete rejection of earthly envy, building a bulletproof expectation of a future physical resurrection.
And it ends with a stark realization that entering this future glory requires recognizing that you are entirely empty-handed right now.
You have to be nothing at all so that Christ can be everything.
It is a brilliant progression from suffering to glory, anchored by absolute dependence.
It really is.
And that leaves you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over. We started by comparing this sermon to a letter diagnosing our modern anxieties.
Today, we spend massive amounts of energy trying to construct perfectly safe, insulated, and successful lives.
We want to avoid the iron hand of anguish at all costs.
But if absolute certainty about the future is forged primarily through present trials,
And if ultimate joy requires acknowledging your own absolute nothingness,
how much of our modern effort to insulate ourselves is actually blocking us from experiencing the very satisfaction we're desperately looking for?
maybe the muddy waters of our current struggles are the exact place where the clarity of the future is meant to be found. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will catch you on the next one.